We're back with our 18 participants. So I continue, I think, with the slides. So we just talked about the XOR problem, and the XOR problem was crippling. Feed-forward neural networks could not solve them. Turns out that even as Minsky and Papert were publishing their paper, there was already an attempt to solve the XOR problem in a big, complex, interesting way that was taking into account the results of Hubel and Wiesel, and in fact, the whole theory of Hubel and Wiesel. The idea that we're assembling hierarchies of pattern recognizers to create recognition and invariance. And the mother of all, let me actually share this now. The mother of all, or maybe the father, of all deep learning networks is the Neocognitron. Now, I have a very cool video. I'm going to just snippet it for you. But this is Mr. Fukushima, a Japanese guy, in the 70s, came up with the idea that we should have this hierarchy and implemented it in computers. We have the most quaint old video here that I hope that I can share with you in a compelling way with the sound. So please let me know. I'm just going to give you a flavor of this video that introduces sci-fi, like 1970s sci-fi.
Reading a book, distinguishing faces, or understanding speech. All these things we as human beings can easily do. But
right, so the cognitive functions and cognitive questions were clear from the outset. And they have this nice brain picture here.
We believe that the best strategy is to learn from the brain. We are studying the mechanism of visual information processing in the brain and trying to use it as a design principle for new information processes of the future.
Hubel and Wiesel, ultimately. Now here we have computers.
Visual cortex of the cerebrum, for instance, neurons are found to respond selectively to local features of a visual pattern, such as lines and
features of visual patterns. That's actually you can see
and edges in particular orientations. In the area higher than the visual cortex, it has been found that cells exist which respond selectively to certain figures like circles, triangles, or squares,
and so forth and so on. Now, there are two parts to the video. I definitely recommend it. It's super cool. But ultimately, the idea is this hierarchy of receptive fields, which is effectively not only solving the XOR problem, but introducing the idea of convolutions. And we're going to get to that from this set of slides. So I definitely recommend watching the entire video, compare them with my explanation. You have the both part 1 and part 2. They are in the Computing Brain channel in YouTube. So if you search for Computing Brain channel, you should be able to find this neural computation list. And these are my first 2 videos of the neural computation list that I put together. But essentially, I think many of you are already intuiting where this is going. What Fukushima did, he figured out that if he has a set of sigmoidal units, and if he does it in multiple layers, he can train individual layers to recognize parts of a little pattern and then reconstitute that as recognition. So basically, here you have from, say, U0, it's your input pattern, 19 by 19 pixels back in the day. You then try to create neurons that sample all of this all parts of the input field for for local properties, such as the feed-forward receptive field that you've done in the project. By tuning weights manually, actually Fukushima could have done this manually, and he done it via a particular training principle that I'm not going to get into here, but it's also very interesting. Just to let you know that he didn't construct the whole network by hand. He trained it, but he could have constructed by hand by selecting which were the features that you then wanted to combine via AND functions, right? Because every single neuron is producing ANDs or OR functions maximally. Conjunctions and disjunctions, where every single layer is extracting from the local field what is that it's seeing. So for example, can be looking into these kinds of patterns. So the first layer here is a very low-level layer that is trying to look into what? Orientation of these bars. And the US1, the first layer here, it will have an array of these recognizers. If you did the feed-forward neural network project, so the do-it-yourself receptive field, I hope that this gets, that becomes an intuition for you. Let me see if there are questions. No questions so far. Here in the bottom layer, then, what you have are the receptive fields of single neurons. So for example, let me cursor point to the first guy here. It's a horizontal bar with 3 pixels aligned in the center. They are saying yes. So this is exactly what I've asked you to do in the feed-forward neural network project. The idea being, you now understand with your brain that if you want to recognize that horizontal line, you have to create a weight matrix. Oh, I have. Sorry, I want to use a prop, and it's in my room, and you cannot see what I'm doing right now, but maybe you can hear it. Oh God, it's not gonna happen. You remember the pin board I had? Okay, so like me not share the screen for a moment so that you can see what's happening here. I've put the pin my pin art thingy on this IKEA board, and it is hanging on it because of the pins. Anyways, sorry. Okay, I still want to share with this video. So back to, this is our room. It's much more boring than the neurons. Okay, back. So actually for this, no virtual background better. So you remember this, a pin board. So the idea here is that if you want to create a neural network that recognizes a vertical line, you have to create a weight matrix that represents that vertical line, or horizontal. So there's no other way to do this. And the receptive field should be of the size, more or less, of the line you want to recognize. So it has to include those neurons. And in the first layer, what Fukushima said is, like, if you want to recognize a circle, let's make a circle here. If you want to recognize a circle, you have to take pixels that represent that circle, right? So you have to take an input space that is large enough to actually have the circle, the whole thing. And you have to then create your weight matrix such that the circle is then imprinted. This brings us back to the notion of topography and the representation of stimuli. Because here, if each of these weights, each of these pins are representing weights connecting photoreceptors in the retina to the lateral geniculate nucleus, the integration neuron has to take from all of them at the same time. But if you can also break the problem into smaller pieces and say, okay, if I want to recognize this an entire circle, I can start with a neuron that looks at, say, just a corner of that circle. And so I'm going to focus only on a subset of those neurons. And this was the insight of Fukushima. He did it systematically by using the idea of Hubel and Wiesel. And here then, this is the mindset you should have. In order to see a T in your screen, you have to have neurons that can see T's in different places of your feed-forward neural network. So this is a T, and it's over here, and it's actually activating this one neuron here. So this is to say that this neuron has a receptive field for a T if it is presented on the top right of your retina. This neuron here has a receptive field for a T if it is on the bottom right of your retina. So in order to have recognition invariance, so here we translated the T from the top to the bottom, you sample T's in many places of your retina. So that's actually the idea, how to create translational invariance. And in fact, it remains in all convolutional neural networks to create translational invariance. People think about the problem like this. You must be having a neuron that is looking at a corner and saying, there's a T here, there's a T here, there's a T here, there's a T here, and so forth and so on. Or an A. Fukushima's results also took into account the fact that the size of the receptive field grows as you increase in the abstraction of the processing layer, which makes sense because you're first looking into small scopes of your retinal pixels, all the way until entire lattice. He then trained the individual networks to specific patterns that he thought were extractable from visual images. So these are effectively, nowadays we call them convolutional kernels. So these are patterns that he wanted to see in the network at a certain level. And the whole numbers are patterns that should appear at the highest abstraction level. So these are also patterns that he trained the network for. And these, in fact, so again, so variations, invariance, like 0 here, has a size invariance. Both of them are zeros. How do you manage to get a neuron that looks at both the big one and the small one? Well, you will have to have some sort of scaling in the weights, in the weight matrix from these convolutional layers. Don't, work towards understanding. There will be more examples. And this is a set of responses of these networks at the different layers. So if you present a 2 to the network, then in layer 1, so these arrays here represent a bunch of these neurons, and you see that it has a horizontal line representing the fact that these are the receptive fields for the horizontal bits of 2. So 2 here on top is horizontal, 2 in the bottom is horizontal. Therefore, these neurons are saying, okay, there is a little bit of horizontal here, there's horizontal here where my cursor is pointing, horizontal here, 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 right? So it's reading out horizontality out of the 2. And this is one of the layers, one of the convolutional layers, the one that has receptive fields for horizontal arrangements. Here is for a slightly slanted diagonal. And these are then the neurons that are extracting the parts of 2 that are in this orientation. As it runs, the other layers say less and less of that. So these are the vertical parts and so on and so forth and so on. And this is then UC1, the first convolutional layer. In UC2, which you're already combining these together, you're basically having edge cells. So but here no longer you see that there's a clear representation of what exactly these receptive fields are reading. So it's not so clear to see. It's simply an orientation line. It is combinations of things. So for instance, here, if you see this little blocky blob here, and you know that this blocky blob is coming from this corner, this is saying that in that area here of your stimulus, you have both a little bit of verticality and a little bit of diagonality. And so these neurons have receptive fields for verticality and diagonality simultaneously, a multidimensional receptive field. Layer by layer, all the way until you have the output layer that is giving you the category of that input stimulus. And so by combining these component representations of the stimulus, you get to a point that you emit a label in the end. And so UC4 is a binary vector, so 10 bits, where only one winner is going to say, okay, so if it's this neuron, it's the neuron that has the receptive field for 2. It doesn't matter where 2 is presented, that's the 2 neuron. What kind of convolution kernel will then be used for such a second, third layer neuron? It's been trained by the stimulus that Fukushima wanted. So the question is, what kind of convolution will be used for the second and third layer neuron? In the 7070s paper, what he'd done was he decided to create some assemblages that represent possible combinations of stimuli. It's an abstract problem. Nowadays, you would just use unsupervised learning on the whole data set to find out maximally separating clusters and then produce a convolutional set of kernels. I'll show that in a moment. But in Fukushima's case, he's trained it to kernels that made sense to him with respect to the problem that he wanted to solve, which is character recognition, invariant character recognition. And so convolutional neural networks are just this, right? So the only difference is that they're not trained in the same way, and they're much bigger than whatever Fukushima might have imagined in his wettest dreams. So here, I'm going to talk about this architecture in a second, but I just wanted to show you, give a sense to what we're looking into here. So you have the input, which is, say, a picture, 512 by 512, or in this case, 224 pixels by 224 pixels. And then you have a convolution layer already that is extracting in these 48 dimensions. So each of these 48 dimensions, notice it's a three-dimensional kernel here, the convolutional layer, where every slice, every one of these 48 slices is an entire layer that localizes receptive fields in the different places of the input, just as Fukushima's first layer. Pooling means it's a combination layer. It's kind of the layer that brings some of these features together. These weights that connect them are in the convolutional layer. Usually the convolutional kernels are either developed via supervised methods, or they can also be simply Gaussians or lines or something that you think are good representations of features of the picture. And then the pooling layer is already a bringing together layer that has trainable weights. Then you have two big fat all connected layers in the middle here, 192, 192. This continue to be more convolution, and this is also creating more combinations between the different features. And at the end layers, you basically take all of the features and train it to recognize for certain patterns. Just to give you before we talk about filters, I wanted to tell you what's the architecture. Then I'm going to go back to this. Here and then we have a deep convolutional neural network, just for you to get a sense of what the inputs would be like. They're basically the pictures. These are the inputs that you're feeding with a label. Oh, it's number 2. Oh, it's a cat. Oh, it's whatever label you want it to be. So quickly about filters. So in Fukushima, you have this. A two-dimensional convolution, which is the essential bit here, can be created by hand, clearly. So if you have an input volume where you have three colors, for example, so you have 3 layers. Now, if your picture is an input volume effect, right? So RGB and flat surfaces. You give this input to a filter and you multiply it by this structuring filter, and you multiply every single bit. You sample every single bit of that picture and multiply by this filter one by one. So you're keeping the topographical structure here. So what this is representing is that this little square from the input is being measured by this filter in every single possible position of the input, and then giving you a value on an output value, volume. So you can see here, there are these gray circles. Those are circles where we cannot actually measure what the entire surroundings are. So they're basically excluded from further computation. And then you have these actual values for the input we're giving. You're multiplying it by the kernel, and you're producing an output volume that represents how likely that filter structure to be present in that input layer. So if you give a 2 to a set of, we can barely see the, okay, yes. So the convolution filter is a set of weights, effectively. They're multiplying the input at every single position. So if your convolution filter is a structuring operation, so it's also a vertical edge detector kernel that has been constructed by hand, the weights will represent the verticality in this particular case. And how does it do it? It does it by saying that we want to maximize the contrast between the left and the right flanking pixels from the center. So the convolution kernel should give you an optimal measurement, an optimal statistic of the verticality of every single pixel in the input. And here what you get in the after you pass this convolution kernel onto every single pixel of the input image by sampling its neighborhoods, is the value that that pixel has according to the convolutional kernel. So you see that the greens here are the places where the value of that convolutional kernel, so basically multiplying the input weights times the convolutional kernel, summing everything up. And so these are the ones that are maximizing verticality. This is clear. And the reds are very minimizing verticality. So you know that there are straight edges here, right? And you can do this with any kernel. So this kernel has been constructed by hand, but you can solve problems asking what is the optimal kernel to give you best recognition. You can produce them via unsupervised learning, and these are, for example, kernels that have been produced by unsupervised learning, and they look like what are called Gabor functions, which are mixtures of two-dimensional Gaussians. Basically, you have two-dimensional Gaussians, you subtract one from the other, and then you have these contrast-like features, which look very much like what the brain recognizes. So essentially then, this is what you're doing. When you have multiple kernels, you transform a picture into a set of slices that are measuring the picture's features according to a certain assumption about what the structure is. And since you're measuring very locally, a pooling layer is just combining locally to compress that data that you obtain in the convolutional layer. So usually convolutional networks have combinations between convolving and pooling, So one it measures and the other one combines. And yes, back to this architecture. I hope that this became clear to you. What are convolutional neural networks? What's a convolutional operation? How is it that it is a filter, a two-dimensional filter in most cases, can also be any dimensionality of filters, of course. Convolutional kernels can measure three-dimensional data, as you do in microscopy often. And then in the end, you train those weights. But let's get that in a moment. I'm going to defer most of this discussion to what you have already learned by 3 blue, 1 brown. If you didn't, go back again. How does labeling work? But one thing I did really want to talk about is what is happening topologically, mathematically, to the input space when we are transforming the stimulus via neurons. So going back to the conception of the single neuron, okay, for a moment, and I want to talk about the meaning of this to XOR problems. So these are typical activation functions. You all know all about transfer functions, the rectified linear unit on the right. And so why do you need nonlinearities? First, I mean, actually, this is one of the reasons, one reason that hasn't been in my slide in the quiz in the beginning, and I want you to think about it for a moment. Say you have multiple linear layers. That means, actually, let me draw multiple linear layers. In multiple linear layers, you might have an input image. Opa, are you seeing this? Yes. Then you have first layer, weights, and you have second layer, and then you have maybe some output. If your layers, if your operations, if your units are simply having an input-output function that is a line, then we can show that all of your multiple layers are equivalent to a single matrix operation. And the reason is clear. If you have here you say now this is your input, and this is layer A, this is layer B, this is layer C, the weights themselves. So if you multiply then your input by A, the weights B and weights C, you can't find one matrix D that is equivalent to it if there are non-linearities. So basically, deep learning doesn't work with linear transfer functions because the linear transfer functions can always be mapped, or because of how algebra, matrix algebra works, they can all be compressed into a single big layer. And you can see this with your eyes, but if you can't see now, I'm not going to get into too much detail, but the idea is that you are just multiplying by a number and summing, so you can find a different number that you multiply your input, like different combinations, linear combinations effectively, that will represent all of the transformations via the layers. So linear doesn't do, and that's the reason. It cannot solve the XOR problem ever. And it cannot solve the XOR problem because if you project it to a single matrix operation, it's effectively identical to a single layer network if the transfer functions are lines. This is the proof. I will put it in the slide. You can check it later. Now, what we do instead then is we scale and squish the input space. And so I don't know if you see what is happening here already. This is the output space of a 2 neuronal network. So you now have a 2 network. It's projecting on a single neuron. And what you're showing is you have your input space, which is your A and B combinations of all the values that you can take. But if you multiply A by W1, multiply B by W2, you're effectively scaling the input space in some way. So if you multiply A by W1, for example, you're basically stretching in the vertical dimension. So if your W1 is positive, then you're going to be stretching this original grid into a stretched grid, right, with W1. And with W2, you're stretching in a different direction. And the combination between the two is going to be some sort of a slanted version of this input space. If you now apply a nonlinear function that squashes its output, you're going to effectively mapping the output space into a squished version. So what the transfer function does, say here I have a transfer function of this input, and so it's sigma of W1A1 plus W2A2, where A1 and A2 are the inputs, A and B inputs, sorry. So what you have here then is the three operations that are being conducted at every pair of neurons when you're having a nonlinear network, a network that has a nonlinearity. So it's processing the input space in this fashion. Take a moment to try to see with your own eyes why. First you have this skewing, then you have, I didn't talk about the shift. The shift would be a bias. It's just basically a constant you're adding to this, and so you shift the whole input space, and then you squeeze. That's the last operation you do. It's the nonlinear operation. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because of the playground. So where is my playground? Playground should be here. I don't know if you understood this, but it's one of the coolest visualizations of what goes on in the deep neural network. And now I want to explain it to you because we haven't really gone into detail about this last lecture, but I think now you have all the tools to really see what's going on. We are dealing here with artificial neural networks, and we have two kinds of supervised learning problems that we can look into. We can have a classification problem or a regression problem. A classification problem will give you basically for two sets of points an output that is a class, which is either 1 or 2, just as we saw at Fukushima, but ultimately the output. Now let's think about two very easily separable inputs here. And I create, this is a data set, this is a labeled data set where the low scoring or the high scoring points are on the left bottom. So this is the orange dots are the training data. So these are all the possible inputs you're going to have. So every point is in one point in the input space. And all of these points together are of one class, and these are another. Say now you have a line and you want to you have a linear function as a transfer function. So basically mapping input space to output space linearly. If we use some sort of backpropagation and gradient descent and you press play, it will find an optimal separating hyperplane for them. And this, what I want to now explain to you is how this works. So first you have features. Features x1 and x2 are effectively the they're the features. They're basically the convolutional inputs of your input space. So they're the dimensions of your input space directly. So x1 is the horizontal component of the data point that you're measuring, and x2 is the vertical component of the measurement. So this is effectively the receptive field of the input neuron, if you would like. So in this case, the receptive field of the input neuron is simply saying that or giving as an output the vertical or horizontal coordinate of the individual neuron. So x1 represents whether something is to the right or to the left, and x2 represents whether something is to the bottom or to the top. What you see when I hover one or the other neuron in the output is basically the receptive field of the input neuron, okay? And you can do this when you have more layers. But if this is what we mean by receptive fields at the level of computational neural computation. So if you train it, you get a nice diagonal hyperplane because your weights, you can even see themselves, you can even edit the weights yourself, are combining the inputs, or verticality and horizontality, and then applying basically a classification boundary, a threshold function, and a heaviside function to then attribute the points to type 1 and type 2. And you see then the output for that particular problem space is, the training loss is 0, because we're perfectly able to classify these points. Now, for example, what you could do is you could scatter the points more and add noise to your input space. Say you don't have perfect measurements of your data input, so you basically say you're wanting to, your input space is how much alcohol you drank and how much you scored, how much alcohol you drank and how many hours you studied for some test, and you want to see whether you're going to pass or not. And you have a noisy measurement about how much alcohol people drink, and maybe well, in this case, the noise is edited in 2 dimensions. But what effectively happens is when you then run the classification, because you have points that cross the classification boundary from category 1, you have a little bit of a training loss, a constant training loss. The larger the noise, the larger the output training loss, right? So here you have almost a 10% training loss because 1 every 10 points is at the other side because of your measurement noise. Now we now know that this isn't so without any noise. This is a different data set now with points that represent an XOR category, right? So here we want 0 and 1 to say no, but 1 and 0 and 0 and 1 to say yes. 0 and 0, 1 and 1 say no, 1 and 0, 0, 1 say yes. For these points, approximately. So, for example, this guy here is blue because it's both high on vertical and high on horizontal. Now let's try to train a network without any hidden layers on that problem. It can't find a classification boundary, and the training loss is at about 50% at all times. Well, that's clear. You cannot find a line to do this. And now what we can try to do is add a layer here with, say, a bunch of neurons. First, let's talk about the receptive field of these neurons. They're creating combinations of the features of the first neurons. And this is then the receptive field you see from the individual hidden layer neurons. This is before training, so it's basically randomized weights. And so these interstitial neurons here are looking into combinations of these inputs. Now, what do you think is going to happen if I try to train this network on the loss? I would use gradient descent and backpropagation to try to find these optimal categories. Effectively, essentially, think it to yourself. Is it able to classify or is it not able to classify? This is an XOR problem with one hidden layer. So if you're paying a lot of attention to what it's saying, it's like with one layer, it cannot solve it. With two layers, it should solve it. If I press play, it is not able to solve it. Can you tell me why it's not able to solve it, please, in the chat? So if your expectation was that it was going to be able to, why can it not? And we're going to solve that in a second. Give it to me, give it to me. I know some of you must have a feeling already for what's the problem, because I just talked about this 1 minute ago. I said that if you have linear activation units, multiple layers effectively are the same as a single layer, right? Now let's try to create intuition about why that is. Let's now create here, let's give ourselves a hyperbolic tangent as a transfer function. Remember, W1, W2 simply scale the input space. When you apply the nonlinearity, when you train it, whoa, your receptive fields start to get more interesting. So your input combination layer is still linear. But now we're able to create non-linear output spaces because we effectively created a sampling of the input space and combined it by squashing. So the output of this network, and let's go for fewer neurons for a moment. Okay, so let's see what happens with only 2 neurons. See, the 2 neurons, we were able to create 2 separating hyperplanes, but they're not able to kind of close it. So in how many ways can you partition this space? That is related to the number of neurons in one of the hidden layers. Is how can you create combinations? When Fukushima is thinking about, what a 2 is made of. A 2 is made of a little bit of diagonal, horizontal, diagonal, diagonal, horizontal. So you have to combine all of these things in an AND way, but you have to exclude the ones that add, say, irrelevant data. And to exclude the irrelevant data, you have to have the negative connections and the nonlinearity. Let me go for a rectified linear unit here so that you can see. With a rectified linear unit, you're effectively blanking out part of your input. So if it is too small, you get rid of it. And it's already sufficient then to start creating more complex decision boundaries. You cannot create complex decision boundaries with linear units. Let's add a couple of extra hidden neurons here. Rectified linear units, sharp boundaries, combinations of those sharp boundaries, ands and ors and nots. So here we're trying to find these boundaries, and you see, it's nice and clear. You have like these very sharp boundaries, and we can use it on the XOR problem very nicely. I just want to do a couple more things, but then I think that the best thing you can do is really go back to my questions and inspect and learn about what are these different components to enrich your intuition about how this works. We'll leave you maybe 10 minutes to play with this. You can go to Playground TensorFlow as well. But just before you go, let me just tell you one more thing. Some of the challenges that I had there, and I actually want to talk about convolution and input space and pre-processing a little bit more. So say you have a data set that looks funny. And this is a funny data set. There's other kinds of funny data sets. It's concentric circles with rectified linear units, nice and convex. So you have to think about how many neurons do you need to actually create a boundary that represents the 2 input spaces. So now this network effectively learned to represent the input space by cutting the input space. But obviously, it will be harder to do here with the two spirals. And in fact, might be, we do need to do more things here together to run. And parts of the question is, what are the things and why, right? I was trying to give intuitions about how we transform the input space at every single level. What if we have two hidden layers, right? So now it's time for you to play a little bit. Go back to the file that I given you later. Right now, just play. Just go to playground.tensorflow.org. Spend there, say 20 minutes until 11:20. You're going to spend there, and I will be answering questions here. And at 11:20, we resume. I want you to play with the playground and get a feeling for these transformations. Okay, so get a feeling for what kinds of things you can create and what's the loss function. Ask me questions. Ask, what is the batch size? What is the ratio of training data to test set? What's regularization? Ask yourself that. Go to Wikipedia. Now the whole idea is that you have a playground, and that playground is a place from which you're going to learn to climb, learn to jump, learn to slide, learn to swing. So it's a playground. Okay. At 11:20, we will reconvene. Meanwhile, I'll be taking questions about this. I'll be playing myself potentially even.